I've always believed that when things start going well, they're supposed to keep going well. That's how my mind wants to work. The promise of progress, the thrill of momentum, the hope for a breakthrough. But for as long as I can remember, every time I edge closer to financial success, something weird happens. Not a catastrophe exactly, but enough to pull me back, to stall the forward motion in a way that feels almost designed to block me. Sometimes it's a sudden impulse to spend money I hadn't planned on spending. Other times, it's an unexplained pause, days or even weeks where I just freeze, avoiding simple tasks or decisions. Or there's this gnawing, unexplained fear, as if I'm waiting for the other shoe to drop before I move forward. None of it makes sense, but the result feels painfully clear. No real progress, no real growth. Just a loop of frustration and stagnation. I remember this most vividly about 6 months ago. I had finally landed a freelance client who was willing to pay well for a project I felt truly proud of. For days, I was riding high on excitement, visions of steady income, perhaps even savings for the first time in years. But almost overnight, something shifted. Out of nowhere, I spent almost an entire weekend binge-watching shows I didn't even enjoy, avoiding emails, ignoring work deadlines that were perfectly manageable. Then came the guilt, the self-reproach, and ultimately, the realization that I wasn't moving closer to that goal. In some ways, I was stepping backward. It baffled me. I had the skills, the opportunity, the motivation. What was stopping me? The strangest part was that it never felt like I was choosing to sabotage myself. I didn't wake up and say, "Today, I will undo my progress." It was more subtle, almost invisible, like an invisible force pulling me away from what I want even before I fully grasped why. And I sensed I wasn't alone in this. So many of us wrestle with this invisible pattern, a sort of hidden barrier that betrays our best intentions. Why does it happen? Why does my mind betray me just when I start to win? I began to pay close attention to these moments, not because I wanted to beat myself up about them, but because I sensed they were messages. If I could understand what was really happening, maybe I could break free. But it wasn't easy. On the surface, I told myself it was laziness or lack of discipline, maybe even fear of failure. But deep down, I felt there was something else, something not about failing, but about protection, about keeping myself safe. That felt counterintuitive. How could blocking my own success be protective? It didn't make sense. This shadow cycle became clear in everyday moments. A purchase that felt like a misplaced reward, followed by regret. A delayed call to follow up on a promising lead, dismissed with a vague excuse. That horrible hesitation when it came time to ask for a raise or increase my rates. And every time, the same script would run in my head. Better not get too comfortable. What if this doesn't last? Maybe I'm not ready. But no matter how loud these voices became, I knew I couldn't keep living like this, building hope only to watch it crumble under invisible forces. I had to dive deeper to understand what was really going on beneath the surface. In sharing this, I hope you hear yourself in these words because this experience is so much more common than we talk about. Not just in how we handle money, but in how we treat our own potential. The dance between desire and fear, between growth and retreat, plays out in ways that are hard to pin down, but devastating nonetheless. It's a quiet sabotage, not always dramatic, but deeply real. And it's not about weakness or failure. It's something more complex, woven into the way our minds work to protect us, even if it feels like betrayal. So here I am, at a point where recognition gives way to curiosity. What if the problem isn't that I'm incapable or lazy, but that there's a protective mechanism I don't fully understand yet? What if learning to live with that, instead of fighting it blindly, is the key to finally breaking free? If this resonates with you, you're not alone, and there's a path forward. Together, I want to explore how these patterns show up, why they exist, and importantly, how we can gently begin to shift them. Because growth, real growth, often feels like stepping into the unknown, and that can be terrifying. But we don't have to face it without guidance or understanding. The journey I'm taking is about noticing the quiet self-sabotage, learning its language, and discovering how to move beyond it, not by force, but with care and insight. It's about reclaiming hope, building trust with ourselves, and opening the door to financial freedom that feels emotionally safe. It starts with becoming aware, with compassion for the parts of us that hold us back, and with courage to try something different. This isn't just about money. It's about how we relate to change, success, and our own worth. And just like any hero's journey, it's messy, vulnerable, and profoundly human. But I believe it's possible to rewrite the story. And if you're ready, we'll take the first steps together. I recall an afternoon when a friend invited me to discuss a lucrative investment opportunity. On paper, it made perfect sense: steady returns, manageable risk, a chance to expand my financial horizons. Yet, as we spoke, a knot tightened in my stomach. My mind raced with doubts that seemed unrelated to facts or figures. Is this too good to be true? Am I rushing into something unfamiliar? It felt less like caution and more like resistance rooted in something deeper than logic. Later, I realized this emotional response wasn't isolated. It revealed a profound psychological mechanism at play, one that shields us from unfamiliar experiences even if they promise growth. This instinctive protection system is much like the body's fight-or-flight response, but tailored to our financial life. When a change approaches, despite its positive potential, our brain triggers subtle alarms. These alarms might manifest as reluctance, procrastination, or even self-destructive choices, all designed to preserve the known emotional equilibrium. Imagine a well-worn path in a dense forest. Stepping off it toward the unknown triggers uncertainty and fear, regardless of potential rewards awaiting beyond. That feeling I experienced wasn't accidental. It was the brain prioritizing emotional safety above new possibilities. One moment vividly captures this intricate dance between opportunity and internal conflict. After drafting a detailed budget to save for a personal project, I found myself unexpectedly throwing a significant amount of money on a spontaneous purchase, a high-end gadget that I neither needed nor truly wanted. In that instant, there was not just impulse, but an unconscious act of defiance, a subconscious tactic to disrupt progress. It wasn't about disregard for my goals, but a covert signal my psyche used to maintain emotional control. Later, as I scrutinized the behavior, I noticed this wasn't isolated impulsivity, but part of a patterned behavior deeply embedded in my habits. Sometimes, the sabotage appears as procrastination, cloaked in deceptively reasonable excuses. I remember putting off contacting a potential client for weeks, despite knowing the opportunity could lead to increased income. On the surface, it felt like laziness or poor organization, but underneath it lay a silent anxiety, a fear of success itself. Success often introduces new responsibilities, expectations, and visibility, which can unsettle our inner equilibrium. It's like standing at the edge of a diving board. Part of me craves the leap, yet another part fears the plunge into unknown waters. This hesitation, rather than a flaw, reveals how complex our relationship with achievement can be. Moreover, I've caught myself wrestling with guilt tied to financial gains. After a bonus, instead of celebrating, I felt undeserving, haunted by questions like, did I earn this fairly? Or will others see me differently now? This emotional undercurrent can tether us to limiting beliefs inherited from family stories or societal messages that money is a scarce resource, linked to manipulation or judgment. The result? Instead of building upon wins, we unconsciously dampen our financial progress to feel safe and avoid stirring conflict within ourselves or our communities. I once discussed these subtle dynamics with a colleague who shared how, after receiving a promotion, she deliberately missed several opportunities to shine in new projects. It wasn't about doubting my abilities, she confided, but a quiet fear that the change might alienate me from my peers or upend the balance I had in my life. That struck a chord. We're not just contending with numbers. We grapple with deeply social and emotional aspects that influence our financial behavior. Our brains are wired to preserve social cohesion and emotional comfort, sometimes at the expense of individual advancement. Facing this truth, I began noticing even more nuanced expressions of self-sabotage. For instance, I realized I often underestimated the value of my work, setting prices so low they barely justified my time and effort. It felt safer to fly under the radar than risk rejection or conflict by asserting my worth. This strategy echoes a larger internal dialogue. The desire to be accepted and avoid confrontation sometimes overrides the drive for financial security or success. Money becomes tangled with identity and self-esteem in ways that are not immediately obvious, but immensely powerful. Now, consider how these patterns might show up when you encounter financial decisions that could alter your life. For example, negotiating a raise, starting a new business, or even budgeting for self-care. These moments often stir the same internal tug-of-war, excitement shadowed by hesitation, hope diluted by fear. Because these emotional conflicts operate beneath conscious awareness, their effects can be insidious, chipping away at progress in ways we don't immediately trace. Recognizing this hidden force begins with witnessing your reactions without judgment and asking what underlying fears or beliefs might be steering you off course. Reflecting further, I noticed the critical role of storytelling. Not the grand narratives of success or failure, but the quieter stories we tell ourselves about deservingness, risk, and comfort. I remember journaling late one night, noticing thoughts that equated financial ambition with greed or selfishness. Such narratives had quietly shaped my actions for years, making bold financial moves feel taboo or unsettling. Challenging these mental scripts became essential for creating new pathways toward abundance. It was like switching the radio station in my mind from a static of doubt to one broadcasting encouragement and possibility. Additionally, I found that cultivating awareness around triggers, the subtle sensations or moods that precede self-sabotage, was transformative. For example, a creeping restlessness or sudden distraction often signaled an impending pause or detour from my financial intentions. By alerting myself to these moments and pausing to inquire gently about their origin, I began to loosen their grip. It reminded me of feeling a shadow in my peripheral vision. Noticing it early allows me to pivot my focus before being engulfed. All of these layers, that instinctive protection, social and emotional dynamics, internal narratives, and bodily signals, compose the intricate tapestry of financial self-sabotage. They reveal how our minds create complex barriers not out of malice, but in defense of perceived safety. The challenge lies in peeling back these layers patiently, embracing discomfort, and cultivating a new kind of courage, the courage to step beyond the familiar shadows toward uncharted possibilities. As I continue this exploration, I invite you to notice your own invisible resistances and to approach them with the same gentle curiosity. Together, we can begin to unravel these threads and reclaim our capacity to move forward with intention. I remember a night when I sat at my desk, staring at a contract that could have changed everything. The terms were fair, the timing ideal, yet a strange discomfort settled over me, a silent resistance that didn't spring from logic, but from a deeper, less obvious source. It was as if a silent alarm was going off inside, warning me to hesitate or retreat. This wasn't about second-guessing. It was more like a reflexive hurdle, triggered by an unseen script running in my mind. It struck me then how often my unconscious scripts had been the puppeteers behind my financial choices, a choreography I hadn't realized until that moment. Digging beneath the initial reaction, I uncovered an intricate web of beliefs intertwined with my sense of identity. One morning, over coffee, I shared with a close friend how I'd frequently undervalue my talents when negotiating payment. "Why do you do that?" she asked. I shrugged, searching for an answer that didn't exist in the usual realm of practical reasoning. Later, I traced it back to an old message imprinting humility as my gateway to belonging. A belief that being less visible or less assertive would protect relationships and prevent confrontation, demonstrating how financial decisions often mirror interpersonal boundaries and fears. What punctuated this discovery was the realization that these internal scripts don't just whisper in isolation, but echo through cultural expectations. Family dynamics had a powerful role in shaping my financial scripting. I recall my mother's cautious approach toward money, always warning against getting ahead of yourself and emphasizing frugality to a fault. This cultivated an implicit message repressed inside me: advance too quickly, and you risk upheaval or judgment. Such inherited narratives often operate silently, like currents beneath a calm sea, shaping responses without overt awareness. As I peeled back layers, I noticed how the voice of doubt would morph into a dialogue where safety edged out ambition. One afternoon, an opportunity emerged to expand my work scope, promising both challenge and reward. A flicker of eagerness surfaced, quickly overshadowed by a cascade of what ifs. What if I fail? What if others think I'm greedy? These intrusive thoughts created a fog that blunted enthusiasm and nudged me toward retreat. This phenomenon revealed how our beliefs about ourselves and the world can erect invisible barriers more formidable than any external obstacle. At times, I found myself caught in a paradox, yearning for financial growth while unconsciously enacting patterns that maintain my status quo. It was like being tethered to an anchor I couldn't see, feeling the tug even as I pulled forward. On a crisp autumn morning, after turning down a promising partnership, I sat by the window, letting the guilt wash through me. Resigned yet curious, I resolved to document these inner conflicts. Through journaling, I exposed recurring scripts suggesting that success might estrange me from those I cared about, or that it wasn't right to receive more. This process illuminated a powerful truth. My hesitation was less about what others might say and more about my own unspoken fears of transformation. Walking the tightrope between desire and reservation also played out physically. I began noticing a subtle rush in my chest or a tightening in my throat whenever financial discussions grew serious. A client's question about rates would trigger a flutter of unease, almost like drowning without water. Recognizing this physiological language was a revelation. It meant my body bore witness to these unresolved conflicts before my conscious mind caught on. From this somatic awareness, I realized how deeply intertwined the mind and body become in shaping financial decisions, often bypassing rational analysis. Interestingly, moments where I avoided financial growth often coincided with deeper existential questions about worthiness and purpose. I recollected a late evening conversation with a mentor who guided me toward reflecting not just on external goals, but on how I envision my role in the world. The question, "Who am I if I succeed?" lingered more than any spreadsheet or contract. This reflection exposed the core tension between craving advancement and fearing the loss of authentic self during change. It felt as though pursuing financial progress threatened an inner harmony I hadn't acknowledged before. One vivid memory was sitting in a bustling cafe, drafting a pitch that could exponentially increase my income. Just as inspiration surged, my phone buzzed with a text from a family member expressing concern about getting too big for my britches. The juxtaposition was jarring, sparking a tempest of worry about alienation and expectations. That moment underscored how social ties and subtle pressures weave themselves into our financial narratives, complicating growth with layers of obligation and perceived judgment. Reflecting on these intertwined layers, it became clear that financial decision-making isn't merely transactional. It is deeply symbolic, communicating messages about safety, belonging, acceptance, and identity. With this insight, I grew more patient with my unfolding process. Rather than power through discomfort, I began to treat hesitation as a messenger, inviting me to decipher untold stories lingering beneath my choices. These new lenses empowered me to break patterns not by force, but by weaving new narratives anchored in self-compassion and informed curiosity. Now, consider how this applies when you confront your own financial crossroads. Perhaps that brief pause before committing to investment isn't just indecision, but a coded message from your inner world. Maybe your resistance to raising prices signals more than fear of rejection. It could be a marker where past beliefs challenge your current vision. Becoming fluent in this complex psychological language creates space to rewrite your story with intention and grace. My journey continues, woven with discoveries about how identity, inherited beliefs, bodily signals, and social dynamics shape the unseen frameworks beneath every monetary decision. It's a story of emerging into fuller awareness, a story I invite you to explore alongside me. I recall a particular afternoon when an unexpected email arrived from a prospective client, offering a contract that promised to elevate my work to a new level. Excitement surged through me, but simultaneously, an almost imperceptible tension rippled across my chest. Rather than diving into the task with enthusiasm, I found myself postponing every related action, drafting proposals, scheduling meetings, even replying to the message itself. The delay puzzled me, because on paper, collaborating with this client aligned perfectly with my goals. Yet something intricate and elusive was unfolding beneath my conscious awareness. This experience led me down a path where I began examining how our beliefs about risk and comfort zones subtly govern the way we move or hesitate toward opportunities. I realized that when change approaches, it can trigger dormant neurological circuits wired to keep us within familiar emotional boundaries. It's less about choosing failure or complacency, more about the brain's propensity to protect us from complex feelings of vulnerability that new ventures sometimes stir. In other words, our mind often weighs the unpredictability of success against the perceived safety of stability, tipping the scales toward caution even when rational analysis urges forward momentum. One day, while reflecting in my journal, I wrote about a nagging storyline that frequently plays in my internal dialogue, the notion that achieving more might isolate me from friends or loved ones. This thought sometimes manifests as an invisible tether, pulling me backward when I inch closer to advancement. An old memory surfaced, my father's repeated warnings not to stick out, implying that fitting in was safer than standing tall. These inherited narratives, whispered across generations, embed themselves deeply into our psyche. Awareness of them opens an invitation to question whose voices we are truly listening to and whether those messages still serve us. Parallel to this, I noticed how often internal conflicts manifest as physical sensations. During a chaotic morning preparing to meet a financial milestone, my heart accelerated, palms grew clammy, and a jittery energy buzzed in my limbs. These were hallmarks of apprehension, not about the task itself, but about entering an unknown phase where expectations and uncertainties intertwined. I began practicing mindful attention to these somatic cues, treating them less as barriers and more as signals from the body urging me to slow down, to engage gently with fears rather than bulldoze through them. Interestingly, breakthroughs happened when I reframed moments of hesitation not as weaknesses, but as calls for deeper self-inquiry. Sitting on my porch one evening, I whispered aloud, "What am I truly afraid will shift if I succeed?" The question echoed back layers I hadn't explored, like the anxiety of losing old identities, being seen in a new light, or shouldering new responsibilities. It was a humbling revelation that progress isn't merely a linear climb, but a complex transformation journey, demanding not just skill, but courage to evolve one's inner landscape. Another time, I found myself caught in an unspoken dance between desire and restraint. After setting a goal to increase my rates, I hesitated to communicate the change, fearing confrontation or rejection. I pictured this hesitation like standing at the edge of a river, toes curling on the bank, caught between retreat and leap. The bridge between where I was and where I aimed to be felt fragile, yet I had to cross it with grace. Recognizing this metaphor helped me cultivate patience with the process, embracing growth as both exhilarating and uncertain. On a rainy afternoon, I shared these insights with a dear friend who confessed she often undervalues her contributions, pricing herself lower than deserved to avoid standing out. Her story mirrored mine, deepening my understanding that undervaluation often serves as a shield, keeping us safe from the exposure success can bring. This avoidance is a protective dance, a subtle signaling that speaks to fears of judgment, inadequacy, and rejection, regardless of the actual merit or talent one holds. Experience taught me that the narratives we uphold about money and achievement frequently intertwine with issues of worthiness and identity. I remember moments of quietly navigating social settings where discussions about careers and earnings felt charged with tension. Observing how these discussions elicited discomfort helped me decode a subconscious belief that financial prosperity might disrupt harmony or provoke envy. Untangling these cultural and relational knots requires bravery, but it also paves the way for authentic self-expression and alignment. Now, consider how this might resonate with you as you face your own crossroads. Perhaps you feel an inexplicable pull to delay that conversation, hold back investment, or downplay your accomplishments. These patterns aren't mere indecision. They are complex messages emanating from deep within your psyche, entangling hopes with fears about change, acceptance, and belonging. By learning to recognize and interpret these signals, you begin to reclaim agency, not by rushing forward blindly, but by stepping gently with self-awareness and intention. Every tension-filled pause or reluctant sidestep carries an invitation to listen closely, to explore what shadows inhabit your inner world, and to honor the multifaceted journey toward growth. My own path continues to unfold, rich with discoveries about how mental frameworks, inherited conditioning, physical sensations, and relational dynamics weave into a complex tapestry that shapes how I meet opportunities. This unfolding isn't a battle, but a slow, tender dance toward integration and freedom. I welcome you to embark alongside me, curious to see what emerges when we embrace the full spectrum of ourselves on this journey. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through my window, I felt a sudden urge to abandon a project that was finally gathering momentum. The sensation wasn't rooted in exhaustion or external obstacles. It was a subtle, creeping pull that whispered, "Maybe this isn't meant to be." I hesitated, wrestling with an internal dialogue that was at once perplexing and potent. It was as if I was teetering on a tightrope strung over a canyon filled with uncertainty and change. My body tensed, my breath shortened. The unspoken fear wasn't about failure, but something deeper, a dread of what success might unearth within me. In that moment, I realized that the challenge wasn't external but internal. It felt like standing on the edge of a familiar shoreline, reluctant to dive into the unfamiliar sea beyond. I recalled an old friend describing similar experiences. A metaphor she used was that of a safe harbor, where the waters might be rough or unknown, but the safety of the dock kept her anchored even when adventure beckoned. This metaphor struck me with unexpected clarity. The mind can tether us to what feels secure, even if it's limiting or confining. What captivated me further was the way this resistance could disguise itself as other impulses, urgent distractions, random tasks suddenly demanding attention, or convincing reasons to delay progress. One evening, while preparing to finalize a crucial proposal, I suddenly felt compelled to reorganize my entire workspace. I spent hours sorting papers and filing receipts long overdue. The absurdity wasn't lost on me. This was avoidance masked as productivity. This pattern had the power to sabotage momentum quietly, like a smooth, unassuming current diverting a ship from its course. Later that week, a conversation with a colleague unveiled an additional layer, the fear tied to uncertainty about identity transformation. As she shared her struggles with stepping into a leadership role, she spoke about a loss. "I'm afraid of losing parts of who I've been," she said softly. Her words resonated deeply. It dawned on me that progress often demands a shedding of old selves, and that's rarely a clean transition. Growth involves discomfort, the grieving of past identities, and embracing a version of self still unknown. The hesitation I felt around success wasn't avoidance of progress. It was a silent mourning for what I might leave behind. Days passed, and another realization surfaced, the paradox of control. I craved mastery over my finances and life. Yet the impulse to resist when things shifted seemed to stem from a fear of losing control in the process. It was as if surrendering to change required a leap of faith that I wasn't confident in making. On a particularly restless night, I journaled about this tension, describing it as a dance with an invisible partner, sometimes leading toward transformation, sometimes pulled back into safety. That dance was exhausting, yet it held keys to learning how to move with resilience instead of resistance. The realization about control extended further when I noticed reactions in my social circle. When someone praised a success I achieved, I often downplayed it internally, a subtle recoil from attention. A friend once called this my shadow humility, a habit of dimming my light to avoid feeling exposed or vulnerable. It hit me how vulnerability intertwines with acceptance and validation. Navigating this terrain requires courage to be truly seen and to own achievements unapologetically, breaking free from internal scripts demanding modesty that borders on invisibility. A poignant memory surfaced, a family gathering where conversations about careers sparked unspoken competition and comparisons. I felt simultaneously proud and uneasy, caught in a web of expectations and judgments. That day, I grasped how deeply social narratives shape our relationship with success, how much we might unconsciously shield ourselves from success to preserve harmony or avoid envy. It became clear that personal choices rarely exist in isolation. They echo in the chambers of culture, upbringing, and connection. One rainy afternoon, sitting with a cup of tea, I sketched out a new approach to these inner conflicts, not as adversaries to battle, but as signals guiding me toward emotional insight. I envisioned myself as a gardener navigating a wild patch of weeds and blossoms alike. Instead of uprooting everything impulsively, I could tend attentively, nurturing growth while gently easing limits. This shift in perspective sparked newfound compassion for my hesitations and renewed motivation to explore the landscapes within. Now, consider how this insight resonates when you encounter the subtle pauses before change. Perhaps a sudden distraction derails your focus, or a quiet voice begs retreat when opportunity knocks. These signs are invitations, intricate clues into the emotional weather behind your choices. By attending to them with patience and curiosity, you offer space for transformation that honors both your aspirations and your need for safety. I'm still learning this delicate art, walking a path marked by both caution and boldness, holding both with grace. There was a moment when I caught myself hesitating before hitting send on an email that could have secured a freelance project vital to my income. The screen blurred slightly as apprehension swelled, an invisible barrier building between me and a decision that, objectively, made perfect sense. I sat back in my chair, heart pounding quietly, wrestling with an urge to delay, to craft endless drafts, or even to distract myself with something trivial. It was a puzzling sensation. I wanted success yet recoiled from the very steps leading to it. The paradox gnawed at me, pushing me to question what unseen forces operated beneath my intentions. The subtle push and pull that drove this hesitation was unlike mere procrastination. It felt woven into my neurological wiring, a curious paradox where my deeper mind clung to a faint familiarity even when it was no longer beneficial. This internal conflict reminded me of an ancient mariner who trusts his compass blindly, even when it points toward turbulent seas. The mind's loyalty to comfort often eclipses reason, anchored by archaic survival instincts shaped over millennia. Like the mariner, I felt pulled between the safety of past patterns and the uncertainty of promising frontiers. I realized that my psyche was not sabotaging, but simultaneously negotiating safety and risk. One afternoon, during a walk through the humming city streets, I reflected on this tension as conversations and environments buzzed around me. A sudden image emerged, waves crashing unpredictably against familiar rocks. The rocks stood firm, grounded in place, even while waters surged wildly. This visual stirred a revelation. My emotional defenses resembled those steadfast rocks, sturdy barriers that withstood currents of change, regardless of their potential to nourish or erode. These barriers weren't inherently blocking, they were protecting. The challenge became discerning when such protection overstepped into restriction. I recalled an earlier job interview when an offer appeared. More responsibility, better compensation, yet I experienced an inexplicable dread. A quiet little voice whispered, "What if this job changes who you are?" Despite the tangible benefits, I declined, haunted by an indistinct fear of transformation. The notion that real growth demands sacrifice of some familiar comfort was daunting. The job wasn't merely an external opportunity. It posed internal demands that unsettled my fragile identity. I began to realize how often I declined invitations to evolve, not due to incompetence, but because parts of me feared disintegration beneath the weight of change. Conversations with close friends opened windows into similar stories. One told me of an impulsive purchase she made right after landing a promising contract, not from extravagance, but as a subtle rebellion against progress that seemed too fast, too real. Another spoke of chronic, busy work, seemingly productive but actually serving as a cushion to soften fear's edge. Such behaviors illustrated a protective choreography, movements aimed at preserving emotional equilibrium when exposed to unfamiliar life circumstances. The irony lay in their disguise. These gestures felt like choices yet arose from deeper emotional scripts steering beneath conscious thought. During an early morning solitude break, I journaled a question that had been brewing. What costs am I assigning to success that haven't yet surfaced? The answer unfolded slowly. Loss of perceived belonging, fear of envy, anxiety about eclipsing past achievements. The costs extended beyond finances. they entangled my relationships, self-perception, and sense of worth. This realization reframed my hesitation as not a resistance to wealth or accomplishment, but a negotiation between multiple layers of identity seeking balance. The strains that accompanied financial leaps were less obstacles and more unspoken contracts with self and others, centered on emotional safety. An evening spent with my partner deepened this reflection. We spoke about dreams not pursued, ideas shelved, and the question of who do I become if I succeed. Their gentle probing revealed fractures in my narrative, beliefs that growth might isolate me in invisible ways or expose vulnerabilities better left concealed. It became clear that these fears weren't signs of weakness, but messages crying out for a new framework, one acknowledging that success can indeed feel like exile if one's inner narrative remains static. Growth, I realized, requires not only external achievement, but internal reconciliation, a realignment of the self with its evolving story. On a hazy afternoon, while organizing my workspace, I noticed a drawer filled with half-started projects and forgotten documents. Each item was a relic of intention interrupted. The drawer, once a simple storage space, became a symbol for the liminal space between desire and action, a waiting room for fear and hope alike. This physical metaphor moved me. I saw that progression cannot unfold if our energies remain divided, pulled between what should be and what is. Letting go of inertia meant navigating through discomfort, ceasing to treat hesitation as failure, and treating it instead as a compass pointing toward deeper awareness. My experiences also taught me the importance of setting boundaries with external influences. Family opinions, societal expectations, or past criticism can become silent moderators shaping our financial choices. A repetition from childhood echoed, voices cautioning me to play small, to avoid drawing attention. To break free, I learned to disentangle these scripts from my authentic desires. It demanded a courageous re-education of my inner dialogue, replacing inherited limitations with affirmations aligned to my evolving goals. Each small act of defiance against old scripts reclaimed a piece of freedom and opened fresh space for intentional growth. I invite you to notice any places in your life where hesitation channels itself in subtle guises, distraction, second-guessing, or undervaluing promises. These signs reveal where your inner world contends with the promise of transformation while safeguarding familiar ground. Embracing these moments with gentle curiosity helps unravel tangled emotions, freeing us to step forward with both caution and confidence. The journey to balanced change recognizes the dance between preservation and breakthrough, not as opposition, but as dialogue, inviting harmony between all parts of ourselves struggling to thrive. There was a particular evening when I sat at my kitchen table, bills spread before me, and a faint but persistent unease tangled in my chest. I knew I had to make a series of decisions that would impact my life's trajectory, whether to invest in a course that promised growth or to keep holding onto the familiar routines that had cushioned me so far. Yet, a whisper inside urged caution, like the soft hiss of a distant storm warning me to seek shelter. That voice wasn't logical. It wasn't even clearly identifiable. It was a shadowed hesitation, wrapped in uncertainty, crawling beneath my skin and rooting itself in my gut. I realized then that the mental machinery behind these moments was far more complex than simple fear or procrastination. One night not long after, I fell into a restless sleep only to wake in the pre-dawn hours with vivid images flooding my mind. A broken bridge, cracked sidewalks, and narrow paths winding through dense woods. In that half-dream state, I understood something profound. Progress often demands passage over fractured terrain steeped in the unknown. I recognized that nerves about navigating rough patches aren't signs of weakness, but natural responses to transformational thresholds. The friction happens when the call for change rubs against the protective layers we've built to avoid emotional ruptures. The metaphor of crossing a rickety bridge captures the paradox perfectly. Stepping forward feels dangerous, yet retreat means remaining tethered to a past self unwilling to evolve. In a conversation with a mentor who's guided me through these turbulent waters, I was introduced to a remarkable idea, the concept of emotional inertia. Rather than viewing hesitation as mere resistance, She suggested it often resembles the difficult momentum needed to shift an entire emotional ecosystem. Like a massive ship at sea, altering course requires more than intention. It demands overcoming the stubborn weight of established currents. I began interpreting my financial patterns through this lens, seeing how each impulsive detour or delay signaled my inner ecosystem struggling to redirect ancient energy flows locked in habits, memories, and familiar attachments. It was neither defeat nor defiance, but a complex interplay of forces reshaping my internal topography. In the weeks that followed, I tested this insight against my personal experiences. There was the afternoon I caught myself scrolling endlessly through social media, ostensibly researching investment ideas, when in truth I was afraid to commit to any decision. My body was restless, and my mind darted from one shiny distraction to another. I likened this cycle to a squirrel frantically preparing for winter while simultaneously refusing to leave the safety of its familiar tree branch. The tension between preparation and safety made no obvious sense at first, but through curiosity and practice, I started recognizing these patterns as manifestations of emotional inertia at play, an attempt to stay both active and protected without crossing into real transformation. Another layer unfolding from this exploration was a deep-seated discomfort with financial self-worth itself. I realized that monetary success did not always translate to internal validation. On the contrary, it sometimes felt like stepping into a spotlight with unclear scripts. The internal monologue whispered doubts cloaked in subtle shame. Was I taking more than my fair share? Did gaining mean losing authenticity? This internal conflict morphed money from a tool of empowerment into a mirror reflecting fragmented personal narratives. I saw how these concealed conflicts could load everyday choices with disproportionate weight, causing hesitancy or impulsivity to arise as unconscious attempts to negotiate self-acceptance within financial growth. During a chance encounter at a community workshop, I shared these reflections aloud and found resonance among others confronting similar undercurrents. One participant described how she habitually deferred her freelance invoices, wondering if billing clients felt greedy or awkward, even when she needed the money. Her story mirrored my own invisible battleground with worthiness, underscoring how early messages about money and humility can intertwine to produce these intricate self-denials. This exchange ignited a willingness in me to rethink money's meaning beyond scarcity or guilt, instead seeing it as a vital language of self-respect and healthy boundaries. One quiet Saturday morning, I sat with pen and paper to draft a list, not of numbers or goals, but of the emotional contracts I secretly held with myself about money. Among them was the surprising admission that deep down I expected financial hardship to be a sort of penance or rite of passage. That belief created a strange paradox. Advancing toward security triggered discomfort because it felt like betraying a story I had internalized since youth about who I was supposed to be in economic terms. Naming these silent agreements gave me new leverage to dismantle oppressive narratives and cultivate a mindset aligned with balance, freedom, and abundance. Throughout this unfolding journey, I found that reimagining financial decisions as dialogues with myself, rather than abstract transactions, shifted how I moved through uncertainty. The habit of pausing and asking, "What else is happening beneath this impulse?" opened me to nuances I had missed before. Instead of reacting with frustration or shame, I approached moments of indecision and detours as invitations to explore what was happening beneath the surface. This gentle curiosity transformed inner obstacles from immovable blocks into signposts guiding me toward deeper understanding and integration. In the midst of these discoveries, I'm learning to trust the rhythms of change, even when they feel uneven or slow. Like the ebb and flow of tides shaping a coastline, transformation erodes old terrain while laying down new foundations, often through cycles of advance and retreat. A recent project that should have launched smoothly took months longer than anticipated, peppered with setbacks. Yet, over time, I noticed how these delays weren't derailments but essential parts of a wider process recalibrating not only external circumstances but inner emotional alignment. Accepting this mystery with patience has become vital to nurturing resilience and sustaining forward movement through uncertainty. I remember a late evening when I found myself pacing the room, restless and uncertain. A promising business opportunity had surfaced unexpectedly, yet instead of seizing it, I was gripped by an odd paralysis. It wasn't anxiety about failure or a lack of skill. It was subtle, an invisible hand nudging me away from embracing growth. I couldn't place its origin, but it whispered doubts that had no clear source. Are you ready for this? What if success changes everything? The tension built quietly inside, tightening around my confidence like vines climbing a once clear path, making progress feel complicated and burdensome. What surprised me most was how my body joined in this silent resistance. My chest tightened, and restless energy churned beneath my ribs as if my nervous system was gripped by a slow, pulsing storm. Rather than an intellectual debate, this was a visceral reaction, as if my body rejected the prospect of change before my mind could rationalize it. Over the following days, I paid closer attention to this physiological dialogue, learning to recognize it as a language my subconscious spoke. It was a litmus test signaling when my internal world wrestled between craving transformation and clinging to familiar safety. On one occasion, I met with an old friend who shared a story that echoed my experience, but with surprising twists. She recounted buying an expensive, unnecessary item right after landing her dream job, something she'd never imagined herself doing. At first, the purchase seemed reckless, a sudden sabotage of newfound stability. But beneath the surface, it functioned as a symbolic gesture, an unconscious attempt to claim some sense of control in a swirling sea of change. This tangential detour helped her, temporarily, to manage overwhelming uncertainty. Realizing this reframed impulsive behavior as emotional self-management, not careless spending. Days later, I observed a different pattern playing out within my own morning routine. Before tackling a financial plan I'd been eager to implement, I became absorbed in organizing my workspace meticulously. Every drawer, file, and pen had to be just so before I allowed myself to focus. This compulsive preparation felt productive but was, in fact, a sophisticated avoidance strategy. It postponed real engagement with goals while giving my mind a semblance of control. Eventually, I learned that recognizing these subtle diversions was crucial in breaking cycles that obscure genuine progress beneath layers of busy distraction. Another crucial layer unfolded during a deep conversation with my partner. I admitted my conflicted feelings about success and the shadows it cast on my relationships. I worried that growth might create distance, a subtle rupture in long-standing bonds. Their gentle response surprised me. Maybe it's okay if some relationships evolve or fade as you evolve. Those words unsettled and liberated me simultaneously. I realized that resisting success because of fear about others' reactions was a form of self-imposed imprisonment. It became clear that honoring my growth required courage to release attachments that no longer aligned with my truest path. Soon after, I journaled about the internal contracts I unknowingly held around money and achievement. One entry stood out: the unconscious belief that accumulating wealth might mean compromising integrity, that money was a currency tainted with moral ambiguity. This belief tangled with my actions, causing hesitation at pivotal moments when financial advancement beckoned. Uncovering these false equivalences allowed me to replace them with affirmations that success can coexist with authenticity, freedom, and values. This mental reframing began to loosen deeply embedded fears, granting me permission to pursue goals without self-doubt's heavy cloak. On a blustery afternoon, I encountered a turning point. Instead of battling my conflicted feelings, I chose to sit with them, cultivating patience and self-compassion. I pictured myself as a sapling bending in the wind, not breaking, but adjusting rhythmically, gaining strength through flexibility. This imagery transformed my relationship with discomfort. Doubts and fears were no longer barriers, but natural currents shaping growth. Embracing nuance replaced harsh divisions of good or bad choices, providing space to navigate complexity without self-recrimination. Now, imagine yourself at a decision crossroads where excitement battles apprehension. That flutter you experience, or the subtle postponement before acting, may signal a deeper internal negotiation between safety and expansion. Observing what stirs beneath surface thoughts grants you insight that transcends willpower. It invites a wise, nurturing dialogue that honors vulnerability while inviting momentum. As I continue walking this path, I realize real progress unfolds not by overpowering internal resistance, but by listening tenderly and responding with intention attuned to the whole self. As I continue along this winding path, the threads I've been tracing begin to intertwine in ways that both challenge and uplift me. There is a peculiar gravity to the emotional landscape surrounding money, a choreography of shadows and light that moves beneath conscious thought, shaping each step I take. It's as if I am standing at the intersection of two worlds, one tempered by the comfort of familiarity, the other humming with the electric possibilities of transformation. The tension between these realms is palpable, a current that pulls and resists, inviting me to navigate with greater presence and compassion. I notice that beneath the surface of hesitation, subtle undertones of protection ripple through my intentions. It's as though an unseen orchestra conducts a symphony of instincts, memories, and beliefs, playing harmonies that both support and constrain me. These internal melodies echo in ways that transcend simple fear or desire. They thread through my perceptions of worth, belonging, and identity. It strikes me how this invisible music can be both a lullaby and a warning, helping me conserve energy while dimming some of the very light I yearn to nurture within. The interplay is complex, and I begin to understand that embracing this complexity might hold the key to unlocking genuine growth. Walking through this internal terrain, I am reminded of the ebb and flow of the tide, sometimes pushing forward with confident surges, other times retreating into quiet pools of reflection. It is not a linear dance, but a spiral, curling back over familiar ground with the chance to deepen understanding each time around. This graduated rhythm invites patience and trust in the process, renews my faith in the subtle shifts that escape immediate notice yet accumulate with formidable power. Tension and release coalesce into a pattern that asks me to attune more finely to the nuanced signals my mind and body offer. Along the way, the whispers of self-doubt and resistance do not scream, but murmur softly, like distant voices carried on the wind. These quiet currents often mask profound truths about what truly holds me back, not through overt obstacles, but through same-old stories stitched into my very sense of self. It dawns on me that these narratives function less as adversaries to be vanquished and more as hidden guides, pointing toward fragments of my experience craving acknowledgement and healing. When I listen with openness instead of judgment, the stories lose their grip and open doors to new perspectives. I've come to appreciate that change invites a meeting with vulnerability, not only the vulnerability of external risk, but the deeper challenge of reconciling who I have been with who I am becoming. It is akin to standing at the edge of a threshold cloaked in mist, where the familiar recedes and the unknown looms large, waiting to be stepped into with trembling but purposeful feet. This liminal space is both daunting and sacred. It asks for a delicate balance between courage and gentleness, urging me to hold uncertainty without surrendering to it fully. There is a subtle alchemy at work here, transforming old fears into potentials, resizing the shadows so they no longer overwhelm but guide. Within this psychological crucible, I sense the budding of a new narrative, one woven from threads of self-compassion, courage, and emotional clarity. The contours of this emerging landscape invite me to envision a life where abundance is not just measured by numbers or external markers, but by the richness of inner freedom and authenticity. It feels less like overcoming an enemy and more like partnering with a well-intentioned, if misunderstood, part of myself. Reflecting on this journey so far, I sense a gathering momentum, not rushing toward a final destination, but a deepening readiness to engage with the fullness of my experience without defensive armor. The once blurry outlines are sharpening into shapes of possibility. The paradoxes I wrestled with are draining their sting, yielding instead fertile ground for integration and transformation. And as I breathe into this space of openness, I realize that the story I am living is unfolding in layers, each one inviting deeper attunement, greater patience, and a profound hope for what lies ahead. I remember standing at the edge of a familiar crossroads, one foot rooted in the comfort that once cradled me, the other nudging toward an unknown expanse shimmering with possibility. A subtle storm brewed inside, stirring unease and excitement in equal measure. It wasn't fear alone. It was an intricate web of emotions, memories, and unspoken agreements I had woven with myself over years. I understood then that my hesitation was not a flaw or failure, but a deeply human response to the tension between safety and transformation. As the quiet moments stretched, I realized how the journey toward growth often unfolds not through decisive leaps, but delicate negotiations within. Like a river carving its path through ancient rock, change can be slow and patient, inviting persistence and tenderness. I began to embrace the paradox of craving progress while guarding against vulnerability, seeing this not as resistance, but as a conversation with my own evolving self. The more I listened, the clearer it became that this interplay held wisdom. Hesitations were signposts, not stop signs. In those reflections, I caught glimpses of something vital. That true expansion requires a kind of inner dialogue where compassion holds space for discomfort. This dialogue isn't about silencing doubt or pushing through with brute will. It asks for gentleness and curiosity alike. I discovered that by inviting my fears into conversation rather than casting them aside, I could transform them into allies rather than adversaries. There was freedom in admitting uncertainty and power in choosing to move forward anyway, carrying my full complexity with me. One evening, as twilight deepened and the world outside softened into quiet shadows, I found myself speaking aloud to the parts of me that hesitated. "I see you," I whispered, voice steady despite the flutter of nerves. "You're guarding me, trying to keep me safe in unfamiliar waters. You're tired, cautious, but still here. I'm ready to trust that together we can navigate what lies ahead." Saying this broke an invisible seal, and a calm washed over me, a newfound companion on the journey rather than a barrier slowing my steps. I invite you to join me in this becoming, where embracing fragility and strength shapes a new financial story. It asks us to relinquish old narratives steeped in fear and scarcity, inviting instead an openness that nourishes growth rooted in authenticity. Success need not demand sacrifice of selfhood. It can bloom in balance with vulnerability. Our inner landscapes are fertile ground, rich with untapped resilience, longing, and wisdom waiting to be cultivated. Even now, I feel the subtle rhythms of this ongoing dance, the hesitant advance, the reflective pause, the courageous recommitment. There will be moments when shadows lengthen and doubts murmur their persistent questions. Yet, each step forward reshapes the terrain, expanding the space where possibility can take root and flourish. And when I remember that the forces pulling me back are part of the weave of my story, not excuses to remain stagnant, I find strength to keep unfolding. So when you uncover that familiar hesitation stirring inside, I encourage you to meet it not with judgment or haste, but with quiet respect. Listen closely to what it whispers about your needs, your fears, the hidden places yearning for gentle attention. In this listening, you unearth the keys to unlock your own courageous movement toward financial freedom infused with self-awareness. Together, in patient presence, we rewrite the narrative, not by rushing toward a destination, but by dancing fully through the transformation itself.